something that happened in Silicon Valley Bank is important to focus on because it could be a seed change in terms of the new world we're in. And I'll just give you two contrasts. When uh, the bank failed in 2008, Washington Mutual, it failed in September of 2008. Before the run on the bank started, it had a total deposits of around $200 billion. In the case of, I think, 17 days, 12 or 15 billion was withdrawn. In the case of Silicon Valley Bank, on the morning of March 9th, it had about 200 billion of deposits. And in the case of 10 hours, 42 billion was either withdrawn or attempted to be withdrawn. Why? Because of this.
Yep.
Everybody can now do banking on their phone. And so the velocity, the lesson to take away from the Silicon Valley Bank situation is we've entered potentially a new era where the velocity of change is beyond basically anybody's comprehension from 10 years ago. And the contrast between Washington Mutual and what happened to Silicon Valley Bank as fast as it happened is really a good illustration of that.
Do you see the reserve requirements changing? Because really fractional reserve lending allows, like, banks can't have all their money because they wouldn't be able to turn a profit. Do you see that changing at all? Like, do you see any regulation coming from or anything changing in the way that we do banking because of what we saw?
Okay, so there's a lesson here, which will be part of my general answer. One of the scary things about Congress is that whenever anything happens, they believe they're the solution. Okay, price of blueberries go up, Congress should get involved. Silicon Valley Bank files, maybe we need to pass legislation. Now, here's the good news. As best I can read it, there's not a bipartisan consensus about what legislation to pass in response to Silicon Valley Bank, although there is a lot of controversy over the fact that Yellen and essentially Powell decided to cover 100% of the depositors. And there's concern about whether it was politically motivated. I have no idea. But the one thing you do have to worry about is Congress thinks they have a solution to every problem. So people are fighting on airplanes, right? There's legislation right now to do something to unruly passengers. Don't we have a bunch of laws that already say you can't do that? So you have to worry. Is a governmental response to everything that happens in society really the right approach? And I would argue, in many cases, not. And in this case, I think maybe the right approach is to re-examine whether the regulators were doing their job. It sure appears to me like they were completely asleep at the switch. And so before anybody jumps to saying we need legislation, we really ought to examine the laws we already have and whether or not they were being implemented correctly, and whether or not basically the regulators were really not doing their job and should have known about this.